Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. Imagine, if you will, the deep, velvet stillness of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. It is the night of September 19th, 1961. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine needles and the first faint whispers of autumn. The world is turning towards sleep, and the winding roads of Route 3 are nearly empty, a ribbon of gray asphalt swallowed by the towering silhouettes of ancient granite peaks. In the distance, the moon hangs heavy and low, a pale lantern casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. There is a profound silence here, broken only by the steady, rhythmic hum of a car engine moving through the darkness. It is a peaceful night, the kind of night where the boundaries between the earth and the heavens seem to thin, inviting the unknown to step through the veil. Inside a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, finished in a striking blue and white that seems to shimmer under the moonlight, sit Betty and Barney Hill. They are a couple returning home to Portsmouth after a brief, spontaneous vacation to Montreal and Niagara Falls. Barney is behind the wheel, his hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel, feeling the slight, familiar vibration of the road beneath the tires. He is a man of logic and order, a postal worker who values the tangible world. Beside him, Betty, a social worker with a keen eye for detail, gazes out the window at the passing scenery. Between them, nestled on the seat, is their small dachshund, Delcy. The dog is usually calm, but tonight she seems restless, her small claws clicking softly against the fabric of the upholstery as she shifts her weight. The interior of the car smells faintly of old leather and the lingering aroma of the coffee they shared miles back. They are tired, but content, unaware that the passage of time is about to become something fluid and strange. As they pass through the area south of Lancaster, Betty notices something unusual in the sky. To the southwest, near the glowing orb of the moon and the steady light of the planet Jupiter, there is a point of light that does not behave like a star. It is bright, almost dazzling, and it seems to be moving in an erratic, step-like pattern. She watches it with a growing sense of curiosity, her brow furrowing as she tries to make sense of its path. It doesn't fall like a shooting star. Instead, it seems to drift upward, defying the pull of gravity. She points it out to Barney, her voice soft in the quiet cabin of the car. He glances up, his skeptical mind searching for a rational explanation. He suggests it might be a satellite that has gone off course, or perhaps a commercial airliner, though there is no sound of an engine and the light is far too intense. He keeps driving, but the light persists, a silent companion that seems to be pacing them, weaving through the jagged peaks of the mountains like a predatory bird. The light grows larger and more defined as they reach a picnic area south of Twin Mountain. Compelled by a mix of wonder and unease, they decide to pull over. The car rolls to a stop on the gravel, the engine idling with a low growl before Barney turns it off. Suddenly, the silence of the woods is absolute. There is no wind, no rustle of leaves, just the heavy, expectant air. Betty reaches for the 7x50 binoculars they kept for sightseeing. She lifts them to her eyes, adjusting the focus until the light resolves into a physical form. It is no longer a mere point in the sky. She sees a disc-shaped object, spinning slowly, adorned with multicolored lights that blink in a sequence that feels almost mathematical. Barney takes the binoculars next, his skepticism beginning to fray at the edges. Through the lenses, he sees the craft traverse the face of the moon, a dark silhouette against the silver glow. It is silent, terrifyingly silent, and as they watch, it begins to descend toward them, a giant, pancake-shaped shadow gliding through the night. They continue their drive, but the atmosphere inside the Chevrolet has shifted. The air feels thick, charged with an energy they cannot name. Delcy is now shivering, a low whine vibrating in her throat as she tucks her head away from the windows. As they approach the iconic rock formation known as Indian Head, The craft makes its move. It descends rapidly, a massive, silent weight dropping from the heavens. Barney is forced to slam on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the pavement as the car comes to a halt in the middle of the highway. Above them, no more than 100 feet in the air, the object hovers. It is enormous, filling the entire field of view through the windshield. It is at least 80 feet across, its surface a dull, metallic gray. Along its edge, 2 rows of windows are visible, glowing with a cold, white light. Barney, gripped by a sudden, frantic need to know, grabs his binoculars and steps out of the car into the frigid night air. He leaves the door open, the interior light of the Chevy casting a pale yellow square on the dark road, as he stares up at the impossible thing hanging in the sky. Standing there on the empty highway, Barney raises the binoculars one last time. The craft is so close now that he can see details that defy his understanding. From the sides of the object, 2 fin-like projections extend outward, tipped with red lights. And there, behind the windows, he sees them. Figures. 8 to 11 humanoid forms, dressed in glossy black uniforms and dark caps, are looking back at him. They are standing in a curved hallway, their large, unblinking eyes fixed on the man below. A wave of pure, primal terror washes over him, a realization that he is no longer an observer, but the observed. He feels a command in his mind, a silent instruction to stay still and keep looking. But the survival instinct is stronger. He tears the binoculars away from his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and scrambles back into the car. "They're going to capture us," he shouts to Betty, his voice cracking with a fear he has never known. He shifts the car into gear, the tires screaming as he speeds away, but the darkness is already closing in, and a rhythmic, buzzing sound begins to bounce off the trunk of the car, vibrating through their very bones. The engine of the 1957 Chevy Bel Air hums with a low, vibrating drone as they merge back onto the asphalt of Route 3. The air inside the cabin feels heavy, thick with a silence that neither Betty nor Barney can find the words to break. Outside, the New Hampshire woods are a blur of deep, ink-black shadows, the tall pines standing like silent sentinels watching them pass. Barney's hands are gripped tight around the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark plastic. He can still feel the phantom sensation of the binoculars pressed against his face, the memory of those large, tilted eyes hovering at the edge of his consciousness like a dream half-remembered. Every few miles, a strange, rhythmic beeping sound seems to emanate from the rear of the car, a metallic vibration that rattles the very frame of the vehicle. It is a sound that feels less like a mechanical failure and more like a resonance, a lingering echo of the craft they just left behind. Delcy, their small dachshund, is curled into a tight, trembling ball on the seat between them, her breathing shallow and quick. She does not bark, she only shivers, her eyes fixed on the floorboards as if afraid to look out the window at the passing sky. They reach the familiar streets of Portsmouth as the very first light of dawn begins to bleed into the horizon, a bruised palette of gray and pale violet. The city is asleep, the street lamps flickering out one by one as the natural world stirs. When they finally pull into their driveway, the gravel crunches beneath the tires with a sound that seems unnaturally loud in the stillness of the morning. They sit in the car for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cools. The air outside is crisp and damp with dew, smelling of salt from the nearby coast and the cold earth of autumn. Barney steps out first, his movements stiff and robotic, as if his joints are made of rusted iron. His legs feel heavy, leaden with an exhaustion that goes deeper than simple sleepiness. As Betty opens her door, the cool air hits her face, but it brings no clarity. There is a fog in her mind, a veil that has dropped over the last several miles of their journey. She reaches for their luggage in the back, but a sudden, sharp instinct stops her. She insists they leave the bags by the back door. She does not want them in the main part of the house. It is an irrational urge, a sudden fear of something invisible clinging to the fabric, something that does not belong in their quiet, orderly home. Inside the house, the atmosphere is stifling. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway feels like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Betty walks into the bedroom, her fingers trembling as she reaches for the zipper of her blue party dress. As she pulls the garment over her head, she feels a snag. The fabric is torn. She holds the dress up to the dim light filtering through the curtains, her heart sinking. The hem is shredded, the lining pulled away as if she had been dragged through thick brush or held firmly by hands that did not understand the delicacy of silk. But more unsettling than the tear is the substance she finds. Clinging to the shoulders and the waist is a fine, translucent pinkish powder. It is unlike any dust she has ever seen, shimmering slightly in the pale morning light. When she later takes the dress outside to shake it out, the powder simply vanishes into the breeze, leaving no trace but a lingering sense of wrongness. In the bathroom, Barney stares at his own reflection in the mirror. His face is haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He looks down at his best dress shoes, the ones he had polished to a high shine before their trip. The leather at the toes is ruined, deeply scuffed and scraped as if he had been dragged across a rough surface while his feet remained limp. He touches the leather, the texture dry and jagged against his fingertips, and a cold shiver traces the length of his spine. The physical anomalies continue to mount, each one a small puncture in the fabric of their reality. Barney picks up his binoculars, the heavy weight of them familiar in his hands, only to find the thick leather strap snapped clean through. He has no memory of it breaking, no recollection of any struggle that would have exerted such force. He reaches for his watch to check the time, but the hands are frozen. He winds the stem, listening for the comforting tick-tock of the internal gears, but there is only a hollow silence. Beside him, Betty checks her own timepiece. It too has stopped. 2 watches, reliable and sturdy, rendered useless in the same moment. Driven by a growing sense of unease, Barney goes back outside to the car. The Chevy sits in the driveway, its chrome reflecting the growing light of the sun. He walks to the back, his eyes scanning the trunk where the strange beeping sounds had originated. There, scattered across the painted metal, are several dozen shiny, circular spots. They look almost like burn marks, or perhaps the imprints of something magnetic. They are the size of silver dollars, perfectly round and arranged in a pattern that defies explanation. He fetches a small magnetic compass from the house and holds it near the spots. The needle, which should be pointing steadily toward the north, begins to spin. It whirls faster and faster, a frantic silver blur that reacts to the metal of the car as if the vehicle itself has become a giant, glowing magnet. The most chilling discovery, however, is not the marks on the car or the powder on the dress. It is the clock on the kitchen wall. They left the diner in Vermont at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. The drive to Portsmouth, even with the winding roads of the White Mountains, should have taken them no more than 4 hours. They should have walked through their front door at 2 o'clock in the morning, while the world was still draped in the deepest part of the night. But as they stand in their kitchen, the morning sun now pouring through the windows, the clock reads after 5. They look at each other, the realization dawning with a sickening weight. There is a gap, a void in the timeline of their lives that stretches for over 2 hours. They can account for the sighting, the stopping of the car, and the frantic drive home. But between the moment the craft hovered above them and the moment they heard the second set of rhythmic beeps, there is nothing. It is as if 2 hours of their existence have been neatly excised, cut out like a strip of film and discarded. The memory of the road, the trees, and the very air they breathed has been replaced by a static hum. They are home, they are safe, and the doors are locked. But as the coffee pot begins to perk and the mundane sounds of the morning begin, the silence of those missing 2 hours grows louder and louder, a dark mystery that refuses to be ignored. The ticking of that kitchen clock became a heartbeat for the heavy silence of their home in Portsmouth. In the days following their return, the air inside their house felt different, thick with an unspoken weight that neither Betty nor Barney dared to fully name. They moved through their rooms like ghosts of themselves, their routines fractured by a pervasive, lingering anxiety. Every shadow that stretched across the floorboards seemed to hold a memory that remained just out of reach, a dark shape at the edge of their vision. Betty found herself unable to trust the sanctuary of their own home. She insisted that their luggage, still packed with the remnants of their vacation to Niagara Falls and Montreal, remain by the back door rather than being brought into the main living space. It was as if she feared the suitcases carried some invisible, celestial dust that might contaminate the sanctuary of their lives. Barney, usually so pragmatic and grounded, began to notice small, unsettling details that he could not explain. He looked at his dress shoes, the ones he had worn on the night of September 19th, and found the leather toes were deeply scuffed, as if he had been dragged across rough ground. The leather strap on his binoculars, which he kept close for bird watching, was inexplicably torn. He could not remember a moment during their drive through the White Mountains where such damage would have occurred. His body, too, began to betray him. The old dull ache of an ulcer flared with a new, sharp intensity, and his blood pressure climbed as he sat in the quiet of his living room, staring at the walls. They were caught in a waking dream, a period of missing time that stood like a wall of fog between their departure from the roadside diner and their arrival on the outskirts of Portsmouth. 2 hours of their lives had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but a sense of profound, hollow dread and the strange, shiny circles on the trunk of their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. 10 days after the encounter, on the night of September 29, 1961, the silence of Betty's sleep was shattered. It began a series of 5 successive nights where her mind was flooded with images so vivid they felt more like memories than dreams. In these nightmares, the world was bathed in a cold, unnatural glow. She and Barney were driving down a narrow, forested road when they encountered a roadblock of figures standing in the center of the asphalt. In the dreams, the car would stall, the engine dying with a final, gasping breath. She described the men who surrounded the car as being just over 5 feet tall, dressed in matching blue uniforms that reminded her of military cadets, with caps perched atop heads that were not quite right. Their skin was a pale, sickly gray, and their eyes were large, dark, and slanted, holding a gaze that felt ancient and clinical. She dreamed of being led away from the car, the cool New Hampshire night air pressing against her skin. She looked back and saw Barney, his eyes glazed and vacant, walking in a deep trance as if he were a marionette being guided by invisible strings. They were led up a metallic ramp into a craft that was disc-shaped and vast, humming with a low-frequency vibration that she could feel in her teeth. Inside, the walls were seamless and curved, illuminated by a soft, sourceless light that cast no shadows. She was separated from Barney, the beings telling her in a way she could understand without words that the examinations would take twice as long if they stayed together. The dreams were not merely visual, they were sensory. She could smell the metallic, ozone-heavy air of the craft and feel the cold, hard surface of the table where she was instructed to lie down. The content of the dreams became increasingly invasive. Betty recalled an entity she referred to as the examiner, a being who seemed to be in charge of the procedure. With hands that moved with a terrifying, rhythmic efficiency, the examiner took clippings of her fingernails and a lock of her hair. She felt the pressure of a stylus moving along the vertebrae of her spine, a cold sensation that sent shivers through her entire frame. Then, the nightmare reached its most harrowing peak. The examiner produced a needle, longer and thinner than any she had ever seen in a doctor's office. She watched, paralyzed by a mixture of curiosity and horror, as the needle was positioned over her navel. The examiner pushed it deep into her abdomen, and for a moment, the pain was agonizing, a white-hot flash that made her want to scream into the sterile air. But then, with a simple wave of the examiner's hand over her eyes, the pain vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only a dull, pulsing numbness. Before she was returned to the car, she was shown a map, a series of glowing dots and connecting lines that seemed to represent a journey through the stars. The examiner pointed to heavy lines and thin lines, explaining which were trade routes and which were occasionally traveled. When Betty woke from these dreams, her heart would be racing, her nightgown damp with sweat. She began to write these details down, filling pages with the descriptions of the small men and the metallic rooms, even as Barney tried to dismiss them as the products of a stressed and imaginative mind. He didn't want to believe that the scuffs on his shoes or the tears in the leather strap were connected to the things Betty saw when she closed her eyes. He wanted to believe they were just a couple who had seen a strange light and gotten tired on a long drive. Despite Barney's reluctance, the psychological pressure became a physical burden that could no longer be ignored. Betty's anxiety was a sharp, jagged thing that kept her from finding peace in the daylight. At the urging of her sister, Janet, who had herself witnessed a strange object in the sky years prior, Betty decided to reach out to the authorities. On September 21st, just 2 days after the event, she picked up the telephone and called Pease Air Force Base in Newington. Her voice trembled as she spoke to the officer on the other end, though she purposely left out the most unbelievable details, fearing she would be labeled as a hysteric or a crank. The call was eventually directed to Major Paul W. Henderson, the Chief of Combat Intelligence for the 100th Bomb Wing. Major Henderson listened to her account of the light that followed their car and the buzzing sounds that vibrated through the metal of the Chevrolet. The following day, he conducted a more thorough interview with both Betty and Barney. In his official report, which was later forwarded to the Air Force's Project Blue Book, Henderson initially suggested that the couple had simply misidentified the planet Jupiter, which had been bright in the sky that night. However, the report was later amended to include phrases like insufficient data and optical inversion, a bureaucratic way of acknowledging that the Air Force could not fully explain what the Hills had encountered. For Barney, the military inquiry was a source of deep conflict. As a prominent member of the NAACP and a respected civil rights activist, he feared that any association with flying saucers would ruin his reputation and undermine the serious work he was doing for his community. He was a man who lived by logic and evidence, yet he was haunted by a feeling of powerlessness that he could not reconcile with his public life. The involvement of the military was only the beginning of their search for answers. Betty, seeking to understand the nature of the craft she had seen, visited the local library and checked out a book by Major Donald Kehoe titled The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Kehoe was the director of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP, a civilian organization dedicated to the serious study of unidentified flying objects. Compelled by what she read, Betty wrote a long, detailed letter to Kehoe, describing the encounter and mentioning for the first time the humanoid figures Barney had seen through the binoculars. The letter eventually found its way to Walter Webb, an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston and a scientific advisor for NICAP. On October 21, 1961, exactly 1 month after the incident, Walter Webb arrived at the Hills' home in Portsmouth. The air outside was crisp with the arrival of autumn, and the leaves of the New Hampshire maples were beginning to turn to shades of burnt orange and deep red. For 6 hours, Webb sat with Betty and Barney, meticulously recording their testimony. He was struck by their sincerity and the lack of sensationalism in their delivery. Barney, though still hesitant, finally admitted to seeing the figures in the windows of the craft, describing them as somehow not human. Webb noted the consistency in their stories and the physical evidence of the car's magnetized trunk and the stopped watches. As the interview stretched into the evening, The house grew cold, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen. Walter Webb left that night convinced that the Hills had experienced something truly extraordinary, something that defied the known laws of the physical world. But for Betty and Barney, the investigation only served to highlight the vast, empty space in their memories, the 2 hours of darkness that still held them captive in a web of dreams and unspoken fears. The winter of 1963 descended upon Boston with a biting, crystalline chill that seemed to seep through the very brickwork of the buildings on Bay State Road. For Betty and Barney Hill, the drive from Portsmouth was no longer a simple commute, but a journey toward a final, desperate hope. The shadows of that night in the White Mountains had grown long and distorted, manifesting in Barney as a persistent, gnawing ulcer and a strange, unexplained ring of warts that had appeared in a perfect circle around his groin. Betty was haunted by dreams that played like a flickering film strip behind her eyelids every time she closed them, showing her faces that were not quite human and hands that were too long, too thin. On December 14th, 1963, they stood before the heavy, polished door of Dr. Benjamin Simon, a man whose reputation as a master of the human mind preceded him. The air in the hallway was thick with the scent of old floor wax and the faint, medicinal tang of a psychiatrist's office. When the door opened, they were greeted not by a man of mystery, but by a figure of immense, grounding authority. Dr. Simon, a veteran of the Second World War who had spent years untangling the shattered nerves of soldiers at Mason General Hospital, was a man of logic and science. His office was a sanctuary of dark wood and heavy velvet curtains that muffled the sounds of the city outside, creating a vacuum of silence where the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of a reel-to-reel tape recorder, waiting to capture the secrets of their subconscious. Dr. Simon recognized immediately that the Hills were not looking for attention. They were looking for an exit from a prison of their own minds. He began the process of regressive hypnosis with a methodical, soothing precision. He decided to treat them separately, ensuring that the memories of one would not contaminate the recollections of the other. The sessions were conducted in a room swallowed by soft shadows, where the light was dimmed to a golden, amber glow. Barney was the first to descend into the depths. As he sank into the plush leather of the armchair, the texture of the hide cool against his trembling hands, Dr. Simon's voice became his only anchor to the present. The doctor's tone was a low, melodic hum, guiding Barney back through time, past the mundane days of the early 1960s, back to that Tuesday night in September 1961. As the layers of conscious resistance began to peel away, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Barney's breathing, once shallow and rhythmic, became a ragged, desperate gasp. His body, usually composed and dignified, began to writhe against the chair as if he were trying to escape invisible restraints. He wasn't just remembering the encounter anymore. He was reliving it with a visceral, raw terror that made the hair on the back of Betty's neck stand up as she waited in the silent hallway outside. Through the heavy wood of the door, she could hear the man she loved screaming, a sound of pure, unadulterated primal fear that no amount of clinical detachment could easily dismiss. Under the trance, Barney spoke of the eyes. This became the focal point of his terror, a recurring motif that seemed to burn through the fabric of his memory. He described them not as human eyes, but as vast, luminous pools that occupied the majority of a pale, pear-shaped face. They were slanted and hypnotic, pulling at his very soul with a force he could not resist. He cried out in the office, his voice cracking as he whispered that the eyes were there, right in front of him, pressing against his own brain. He described the entities as being shorter than a man, perhaps 5 feet tall, with skin the color of a dull, weathered gray slate. They wore dark, metallic uniforms that shimmered with a subtle, oily sheen in the dim light of his memory. He recalled the moment he was led up a ramp, his feet feeling heavy as if moving through deep water, the air around him humming with a low-frequency vibration that vibrated in his teeth. The entities didn't speak with mouths. Their thin, slit-like lips remained motionless. Instead, their thoughts arrived in his mind like sudden, cold splashes of water. He felt a sense of profound helplessness, a realization that his physical strength, which had served him well throughout his life, was utterly useless against these small, silent figures. The terror was so intense that Dr. Simon often had to intervene, speaking in a firm, commanding voice to keep Barney from slipping into a state of total psychological shock. When it was Betty's turn to sit in the amber light, her recollections were different in tone, though no less startling. Where Barney was consumed by emotion, Betty was observant, her social worker's mind recording the details with a chilling, clinical clarity. She described being led into a room that was curved and seamless, the walls glowing with a soft, sourceless luminescence that cast no shadows. She spoke of a figure she called the leader and another she referred to as the examiner. The atmosphere inside the craft was sterile and quiet, smelling of nothing at all, a void of scent that felt more unnatural than any foul odor. She recounted the physical examination with the detached precision of someone watching a procedure from a distance. She felt the coldness of a metal table against her spine, the texture of the surface surprisingly smooth, like polished bone. The most harrowing part of her testimony involved a long, slender needle. She described the examiner holding it up, the light catching the silver length of it before it was plunged into her navel. She felt a sharp, blooming pain, a sensation that she had never experienced before, but then, as if a switch had been flipped, the pain vanished. One of the entities had waved a hand over her, and the agony dissolved into a strange, numb warmth. It was during these sessions that she also spoke of a star map, a three-dimensional projection of dots and lines that the leader had shown her, a map of home that would later become a cornerstone of the entire case. As the sessions stretched into the spring of 1964, Dr. Simon began to weave a complex web of post-hypnotic suggestions. He was careful to ensure that neither Betty nor Barney remembered what they had said while under the trance once they woke up. They would leave the office on Bay State Road, feeling a strange, hollow sense of relief, unaware of the tapes that continued to spin behind them, filled with the sounds of their own voices describing a world beyond human understanding. The doctor watched them from his window as they walked to their car, two ordinary people in an extraordinary circumstance. He remained a skeptic, wondering if these memories were merely a shared fantasy, a way for the couple to process the immense stress of being an interracial pair in a divided America. And yet, the consistency of their accounts, even when separated by weeks and walls, was a puzzle that logic could not easily solve. The tape reels turned, capturing the details of the gray skin, the telepathic whispers, and the missing hours. The memories were no longer locked in the dark corners of their minds. They were now etched into magnetic tape, waiting for the world to listen. For the Hills, the sessions were a slow exorcism of the silence, a gradual reclaiming of the time they had lost on that lonely road in the White Mountains. But the more they remembered, the more the world they returned to began to feel like a foreign place. A thin veneer of normalcy stretched over a terrifying, vast unknown. The memories began to surface not as a single flood, but as a series of cold, disjointed images, flickering like an old film reel caught in a projector. Under the steady, rhythmic guidance of Dr. Simon, the veil of that missing time in 1961 started to fray at the edges. Barney and Betty found themselves back on that lonely stretch of New Hampshire road, but now the car was no longer moving. The air felt heavy, saturated with a strange, pulsing vibration that hummed deep within their chests. They were led through the tall, damp grass, their feet barely touching the earth, toward the metallic belly of the craft. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The natural scents of pine needles and night air were replaced by a sterile, clinical sharpness, a smell like ozone and burnt hair. The walls were a pale, matte gray, curved and seamless, glowing with a soft, sourceless luminescence that cast no shadows. They were separated then, led into different rooms by hands that felt like smooth, damp leather, firm but strangely devoid of warmth. Barney was guided to a room where the light was brighter, more aggressive, reflecting off surfaces that seemed to be made of polished bone or some unknown, pearlescent metal. Barney lay upon a rectangular table that felt impossibly narrow and as cold as a frozen pond. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, a defensive reflex born of a fear so deep it felt ancient. He could feel the beings moving around him, their movements fluid and silent, punctuated only by a series of low, clicking sounds and rhythmic hums that seemed to vibrate directly into his skull rather than through his ears. He felt a pressure against his skin, a meticulous prodding that started at his feet and moved upward with clinical precision. A device, cup-like and chillingly cold, was placed over his groin. He felt a strange, tugging sensation, a collection of samples that left him feeling violated and hollow. He could hear them counting, though no words were spoken. It was a thought pressed into his mind. 1, 2, 3, as they ran their fingers down his spine, tracing each of his vertebrae with the curiosity of a child examining a fossil. They turned him, probed his mouth, and peered into his ears with instruments that made a soft, whirring sound like a distant hive of bees. The lack of vocal communication made the room feel heavy, a suffocating silence where the only reality was the tactile sensation of their hairless fingers and the steady, artificial glow from the ceiling. In a separate chamber, Betty's experience was marked by a terrifying intimacy. She was asked to remove her blue dress, but the beings seemed perplexed by the mechanics of human clothing. Their long, slender fingers fumbled with the metal teeth of her zipper, tugging and pulling with a clumsy force until the stitching gave way with a sharp, sickening rip. They were not cruel, but they were utterly clinical, devoid of the social graces of her world. She was placed on a similar table, and the examination began. They tested her joints, bending her elbows and knees with a rhythmic motion that felt like they were measuring the limits of her biology. Then the leader approached her with a long, slender needle. He spoke to her, his voice not a sound in the air but a resonance in her mind, telling her that it was a simple test, a way to see how she was built. He pressed the needle into her navel, and a white-hot spark of agony exploded through her abdomen. In the safety of the office in 1964, Betty's body arched on the couch as she relived that moment of trauma, her breath coming in ragged gasps until the doctor's voice pulled her back from the brink of that memory. The pain in the craft had been brief, extinguished almost instantly by a touch from the leader, but the psychological mark it left was a deep, jagged scar. As the physical trials ended, the tension in the room seemed to soften, replaced by a strange, intellectual curiosity. Betty, ever the social worker, found her voice and began to ask questions. She wanted to know where they had come from, how they had found their way to this small, blue planet tucked away in a corner of the galaxy. The leader, a figure with large, obsidian eyes that seemed to swallow the light of the room, led her to a wall that had previously appeared solid and gray. With a gesture that was almost elegant, he caused a portion of the wall to dissolve, revealing a three-dimensional display that hung in the air like a constellation of captured fireflies. It was a map of the stars, but unlike any map Betty had ever seen in a textbook. There were no borders, no labels in English, only points of light that glowed with different intensities of white, yellow, and soft, bruising violet. The map had a depth to it, a perspective that made her feel as if she were peering through a window into the very heart of the cosmos. The stars were connected by a delicate web of lines, some bold and solid, others thin and broken, weaving a complex pattern of light across the darkness. The leader pointed toward the map, his long finger hovering near a cluster of two bright, twin stars that sat near the center of the display. He explained through that same mental resonance that the solid lines represented trade routes, the well-traveled highways of their civilization, where ships moved back and forth with the regularity of a heartbeat. The broken lines, he said, were for exploration, paths carved into the unknown reaches of space where they only occasionally ventured. He pointed to a small, solitary dot of light at the edge of the web and told her that this was her sun, a tiny, isolated point in a vast, interconnected neighborhood. When Betty asked where his home was, he looked at her with an expression she interpreted as a mix of pity and patience. He asked if she knew where she was on the map, and when she confessed she did not, he simply waved his hand. "If you do not know where you are," he seemed to imply, "then I cannot tell you where I am." Years later, under the hypnotic trance, Betty would meticulously recreate this map on paper, drawing 12 prominent stars and a small triangle of 3 lesser lights. She would draw the trade routes and the exploration paths with a trembling hand, a map that would later be identified as the Zeta Reticuli system, a pair of sun-like stars 39 light-years away. In that moment on the craft, however, it was simply a haunting, beautiful display of a universe that was far larger and far more crowded than she or Barney had ever dared to imagine. The map had been drawn, the stars had been named, and the missing hours had been filled with the silver light of an impossible memory. But for Betty and Barney Hill, the true journey did not end on that lonely stretch of Route 3, nor did it conclude in the quiet, hushed office of Dr. Simon. Instead, it followed them home to the small, salt-aired city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Their house on Ann Avenue became a vessel for a mystery that refused to be anchored. Inside those walls, the air often smelled of old paper, the sharp scent of Barney's favorite tobacco, and the faint, lingering aroma of the sea that drifted in from the coast. The wooden floorboards would groan softly under Barney's weight as he paced the hallway during his long nights of insomnia. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than it had before that September night in 1961, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the 2 hours that had been stolen from the fabric of their lives. They tried to return to the rhythms of the mundane. Barney continued his work for the United States Postal Service, his fingers sorting through thousands of envelopes, the paper crisp and dry against his skin, while Betty dedicated her days to the complexities of social work, helping children navigate a world that was often as confusing as her own dreams. But the peace they sought was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the ring of a telephone or the weight of a secret that was slowly beginning to leak into the world. The toll of their experience manifested not just in memories, but in the very fibers of their bodies. Barney, a man of profound intellect and a tireless advocate for civil rights, found his health beginning to fray. The stress of the unknown, coupled with the pressure of being an interracial couple in an era of deep social upheaval, took a physical form. He suffered from persistent ulcers that burned like embers in his stomach, and a rising tide of hypertension that no medicine seemed to fully quiet. He often looked at his reflection in the mirror, searching the lines around his eyes for the man he had been before the light in the White Mountains had found them. There were strange, inexplicable warts that appeared on his skin, a physical echo of the examinations he had described under hypnosis. In the quiet hours, when the New England fog rolled in to swallow the streets, the couple would sit together, the warmth of a shared pot of tea between them. They were bonded by a trauma that no one else could truly fathom. They had seen the eyes of the others, those large, tilted, dark pools that seemed to hold the coldness of deep space. Even as they worked with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, fighting for a better world on Earth, their minds often drifted back to that craft, to the star map, and to the leader who had looked at them with a gaze that was neither cruel nor kind, but merely alien. In 1966, the world was invited into their living room with the publication of The Interrupted Journey. The book, written by John G. Fuller, turned their private nightmare into a public sensation. Suddenly, the quiet social worker and the diligent postal clerk were the faces of a new and terrifying phenomenon. The silence of their home was replaced by the constant scratching of reporters' pens and the blinding flash of cameras. They received thousands of letters, the envelopes piling up like snowdrifts on their dining table. Some were from people who had seen their own lights in the sky, desperate for validation, while others were filled with the cold venom of skepticism. Betty handled the attention with a certain iron grace, her social worker's pragmatism shielding her from the harshest critiques. She became the first lady of the unknown, a woman who spoke of extraterrestrials as if they were simply neighbors from a very distant street. But Barney felt the weight of the spotlight more heavily. He was a private man, a dignified man, and the sensation of being a curiosity under a microscope was a burden that pressed down upon his heart. He stayed by Betty's side, appearing on television and speaking at conferences, his voice steady even as his internal health continued to decline. He was the first to show the world that the encounter was not a fantasy of the mind, but a struggle of the spirit. The end for Barney came far too soon. On February 25, 1969, at the age of only 46, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. The suddenness of his passing left a void in the Portsmouth house that no amount of research or public acclaim could fill. Betty was left alone with the legacy of their shared experience. In the decades that followed, she did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, she leaned into the mystery. She became a fixture in the growing community of those who looked to the stars, often traveling to speak about that night in 1961. She watched as the image of the beings they had described, those short, gray figures with large heads and hypnotic eyes, became the standard template for the modern alien. She had been the first to give them a shape, a voice, and a place in the cosmic neighborhood. As she grew older, her home became a museum of the extraordinary. She kept the blue dress she had worn that night, the one with the torn hem and the strange, purple powder that had never been fully explained. She kept the sketches, the tapes of their sessions, and the memory of Barney's hand gripping the steering wheel as they fled through the darkness. Even in her 80s, Betty remained sharp, often dismissing those she called the crackpots who she felt were muddying the waters of true investigation. She died on October 17, 2004, having lived 85 years on a planet that she knew, with absolute certainty, was being watched from above. Today, a historical marker stands in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, not far from where the encounter began. It is a humble sign, made of green metal with white lettering, marking the first widely reported alien abduction in human history. It stands as a testament to a couple who were brave enough to speak their truth at a time when the world was not ready to hear it. The legacy of Betty and Barney Hill is not found in the answers they provided, but in the questions they left behind. They changed the way we look at the night sky, turning the twinkling lights of the stars into potential doorways. The Zeta Reticuli system, those two distant suns, remains a point of fascination, a destination etched into a map that Betty drew from a memory she shouldn't have possessed. Their story is a reminder that the universe is vast, and our understanding of it is still in its infancy. It is a story of love, of resilience, and of the profound loneliness of being the first to see the unknown. As the years turn into decades, the details of that night may soften at the edges, but the core of it remains as bright as the craft that hovered over their car. The Hills have long since returned to the earth, resting in a quiet cemetery in Kingston, but the echoes of their journey continue to ripple through our culture, whispering of the things that wait for us in the deep, silent reaches of the dark. As we finish our journey through the memories of Betty and Barney, we return to the stillness of the present. The hum of the world outside is distant now, like the fading buzz of an old radio. The stars are up there, silent and watchful, but for tonight, they are just lights in the velvet sky. You are back in your own space, surrounded by the familiar comfort of your room. The air is cool, the blankets are heavy and warm, and the mysteries of the universe can wait for another dawn. There is no need for maps or missing time here. There is only the steady rhythm of your breathing and the gentle pull of sleep. Let the questions of the white mountains drift away like smoke in the wind. Let the image of the craft dissolve into the soft shadows of your room. You have traveled far through the history of the unknown, and now it is time to rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.